Hi, kids. It's time for Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. Oh no, I hope not. Let's read. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting down out of the icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and each time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. And because we are a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on, he became ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away. And all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then all at once the meals became thinner. One reason the one reason for this was the toothpaste factory. The place where Mr. Bucket worked suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he could manage to earn a few pennies was by shoveling the snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everybody in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory, and every day he came near to it, he would lift his small pointed nose high into the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep swallowing breaths as though he were trying to eat the smell himself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket one icy morning, "that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can one do?" murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread into his plate at breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched, and his skin was drawn so tightly over his cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did so as to save his strength in the mornings. He left the house 10 minutes earlier so he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during recess, resisting himself while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by a piece of paper that was lying in the gutter, in the snow. The paper was of a greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. What do you think it was? The clues we have are a piece of paper that's greenish in color that he kind of knows what it is. What do you think it is? Maybe we should stop now. No? He saw at once what it was. It was a dollar bill! Quickly, he looked around him. Had somebody just dropped it? No, that was impossible, because part of it. No, that was impossible because of the way part of it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the sidewalk, their chins sunk deep in the collars of their coats, like this, because it was so cold. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then it was his, this dollar. Could he have it? Then was it his, this dollar? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole dollar. He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment. Only one thing. Do you remember? Can you think of what it might be? What one thing might he only be thinking of right now? If you guessed food, you're right. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving toward the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. 10 paces. That might be 10 feet. It was a newspaper and stationery store, the kind that sells almost everything, including candy and cigars. And what would he do? He whispered quickly to himself. He would buy one luscious bar of candy and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there. And the rest of the money he would take straight back home to his mother. Or will he? The next chapter is called The Miracle. I hope you come back for chapter 11, The Miracle. See you then.